Welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week we'll bring something new to the table, discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, you're up this week. What are you bringing to the table today?
Yeah, it's my turn again. That's how it works. Let's trade off each week. That's how it goes. I'm bringing an article from Dissent magazine called Indigenous Resistance is Post-Apocalyptic. It's a discussion between Nick Serpe and Nick Estes. And this was written in 2019 after Nick Estes released a book called Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline, and the long tradition of Indigenous resistance.
That's a long title.
It is a long title. There's a lot to that, and there's a lot to the subject as well.
Yes.
And this article is mostly a discussion about that book and another one that Nick Estes co-edited with Jaskira and Dylan, and that one is called Standing with Standing Rock, Voices from the No DAPL Movement. No DAPL was Dakota Access Pipeline.
That's right.
So I'm going to quote the article directly to introduce this because it's a great synopsis, and Nick Serpe did the work for me.
Nice.
So, what do I need to
Why
write?
recreate the wheel? Yeah,
Exactly.
Absolutely.
So he said, quote, "In Our History is the Future, Nick Estes, a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe, uses the occasion of the 2016-2017 grassroots movement against the Dakota Access Pipeline, the largest indigenous-led protest movement in North America in the 21st century, to look at the longer history of resistance to settler colonialism by the Oceti Sakowin, or Seven Council Fires, often referred to by the settler-originated name Great Sioux Nation. While the movement against that pipeline now lies in the past, Estes explains how it continues to feed movements in motion today. In this interview, he also outlines what climate justice activists can learn from indigenous political struggle and why decolonization must be an essential part of any serious left-wing agenda in the United States and beyond.
Yes.
And this is really a great discussion. This article, I really enjoyed it.
Yes.
And just the depth that they brought to it. And it showed how intertwined history and the present really are in so many ways.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's a lot here. I'm excited to talk about it. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I agree with you. This was awesome. It was absolutely a great conversation between the two of them and really an analysis of, I think, what should inform our activism and our movements and our fight for collective liberation in so many ways. So yeah, I'm really glad you found this piece. I'm excited to talk about it. I especially appreciated, I think, the focus on the importance of always remembering and revisiting and using lessons from our history, like you say, and from our historical movements, like the one against the Dakota Access Pipeline. Because I think there's so much for us to continue to learn from that and to use from all of that. And so one of the early points that Nick Estes makes about this in their conversation as it relates to indigenous people and indigenous movement and movement work is just how wrong U.S. history has often been in telling that history well in an accurate manner, and how there is, in fact, an incredible connection that can be made and a critical through line in indigenous movements throughout history. So he says this, quote, "U.S. history typically dates anything about indigenous people as happening in the 19th century or before. There is not a sense of a continuity from the 19th to 20th century. But in my research, for example, I found a key link that carried 19th century resistance into 20th century movements." And then a little bit later, he goes on to say, "This history makes Standing Rock simultaneously exceptional and not exceptional. As an organizer and an intellectual, I think there is purchase to that kind of thinking, not just thinking about your movement as doing something new, but as a continuation. Standing Rock was a reiteration of traditions of resistance, the unification of grassroots movements with tribal councils, the treaty councils, the reunification of our 7 nations, the Oceti Sakowin. Alongside all of these, you saw the best of our diplomatic tradition. Lakota means friend and ally. That's one of our primary tools of resistance. It was a convergence of all of those elements. That's why Standing Rock was a certain kind of historical turning point, not just for us as Oceti Sakowin, but for the indigenous movement in America. And I just appreciate that analysis and always appreciate, getting the opportunity to learn more about history and learning from history like this. And I love the connections that he makes there. I love his use of the word purchase. I think there's purchase to that kind of thing. And there's some real value in thinking about our movements being continuations of work that's come before and work that certainly will continue beyond any of us are here.
Yeah, because I think there's so much to be said about feeling connected to that history.
Yes.
And, at one point their discussion turns to the concept of water protector.
Yeah.
Which was used a lot in the context of the resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
And they talk about the origins of that and the concept of water is life, which was used as a rallying cry.
That's right.
And this is, centuries old, both of these concepts. And Nick Estes talks about the significance of water beyond the obvious, which is hydration,
Of course,
and watering crops and or livestock and stuff, but as a means of travel. So he says, quote, "Our first relationship with the United States government was mediated by the control over a water source. It wasn't just about drinking water, which is important, or watering animals or plants. Water is life in the sense that mobility is life. It gave the ability to move and to travel and to hunt and fish. That first relationship with the United States was also inherently a military encounter. So we called them milahanska, which means long knives, because of the sabers they carried. Later on came fur traders and militarized units, the vanguards of capitalism. Then the Army Corps of Engineers, who eventually determined the path that the Dakota Access Pipeline would take." I love the through line of history there and the way that all those things are connected to the way that water was used and is used, because water is life in the literal sense, but also because of the mobility. It gets to travel and hunt and fish, as he said. And this reminds me of the point we learned about in the documentary a few weeks back, Lakota Nation versus the United States, where the folks who were interviewed talked about there being a reciprocal relationship between the Lakota and the land, rather than the ways that settlers look at the land as a place of extraction of value. You think to the Army Corps of Engineers or to those fur trappers, it was all about what can we get out of this land. We can transport oil through here, or we can look at all this fur on these animals
and the money we can make
trade. And so they're looking at it as not as things to use to travel and to connect with the nature, but how do we take stuff from this? And Nick Estes goes on to say something about this in particular. And he says, "I don't want to romanticize us as indigenous people, but we did have a certain kind of relationship that wasn't perfect, but was an attempt to seek correct relations with the non-human world. I don't think it's the solution, but it's the kernel of a larger solution to the current catastrophe that we're facing with climate change. Indigenous people have a lot to say and an important role to play in how we address these issues." And I think he's right. Like it's not going to fix everything.
No.
Changing that relationship to the land and to the non-human world, as he calls it, but changing that one underlying value of how we see ourselves in relation to the non-human world is going to give us like a smoother pathway, I think, on figuring out the climate crisis and decolonization, and ultimately how we work with one another as humans, how we see one another as humans. Because I think if we're in a better sort of reciprocal relationship with the non-human world, it's easier to set ourselves up to have better reciprocal relationships with our fellow humans. And have those reciprocal relationships become more clear and more of a driving value of how we organize ourselves.
Absolutely. I think that's brilliant. And I absolutely agree. When I read this, I thought about, and I don't mean to make light of this situation, but often when I'm talking to friends or family just about the environment and global warming and the climate crisis, I joke about how one day the planet is just going to implode, right? It's just one day we're going to be driving and it'll just implode and that'll be it.
Because it will have taken too much.
It will have taken too much and that will be it. And we really have we can't say, how dare you? And I'm actually really worried about that. And so I think there's real beauty and brilliance and power in how indigenous people are in relationship with this planet that I totally get and understand. And I think we could all learn a lot from. And so, I appreciate your thoughts on that and the connection that could happen if we change the value in which we place on that relationship and what that could mean for us as human beings, how we could do the same kind of work with each other. What a novel concept.
All right. Yeah.
Sort of related to that, one of the other things that Nick talks about, sort of in that same part of the discussion, is the Lakota's relationship with buffalo. And I thought it was another illustration of all of this.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, I'll bring this. So I'm glad you brought the water piece. So he says, quote, "This is a huge word in Indigenous studies right now, relationality, that I think has become mystified. We're not the Na'vi of Avatar running around plugging our brains into trees trying to download data. I go back to the buffalo because buffalo relations really represent the form of relationality that we had with animals. It wasn't just this mystical kind of thing where we were communing with them outside of history. They represented a source of life for us in the sense that without the buffalo, we wouldn't be the Lakota people by mere fact that we wouldn't have a food source. Our relationship with the buffalo wasn't just one way. They weren't just providing for us. We managed those herds. We cleared out the land for pasture. We would burn it to clear the landscape to ensure the survival of the buffalo nations. That is a very material relationship. There is reverence in our stories and our songs for the buffalo. But I think those cultural protocols were created to prevent us from overexploitation and from throwing out the balance of that relationship. And so, I think there's a tremendous need for all of us to learn from that kind of thinking and the value there, and this idea that we should take care of and shouldn't overexploit our planet and our natural resources, right? As we've done that, and the world is literally on fire right now. And you're right. I think all of this, again, for me, connects to this idea of how we could potentially treat each other. If we can do this for the planet, we could maybe do this for each other. And I think that's at the center of so many of our movements and our activism as well.
Yeah, because it changes the way that it just changes the hierarchy of things.
Yes.
And it just shakes everything at the core to change so many things.
Right.
And again, it's not going to be everything.
No.
It's going to reverberate. It's
Yeah,
going to change
it
more
could be
things.
a domino effect. Could be absolutely. Yeah.
It's going to be a big ripple that changes a lot of other things in the web of all of that. So one of the key points that Nick Estes makes pretty quickly is about class and class solidarity. So he says, quote, "I think it's just that how we define class in this country by traditional or historical elements of the left essentially erases Indigenous people because it prioritizes the needs of settler society over Indigenous nationhood. They're often framed as competing systems," which I thought was just a great way to shake up my thinking a little bit as I learn more from him in this conversation, because within the very context of class, delineations is the assumption of settler status. So if you're poor or working class, you're still a settler,
right,
or a survivor of enslavement, or a more recent immigrant or what have you. We don't see the connection between how settler colonialism is tied up into our class structure in much the same way that we don't see the ways that class and race are tied together.
Yes.
And how white supremacy is actually operating throughout all of this.
Yes.
And so it reminds me of all the things we learned while reading Solidarity about how we've all been separated from one another purposefully to focus on ourselves as individuals. And the way that individualism works is a core concept of white supremacy and capitalism, and it drives us all apart to see ourselves in competition with one another for the few resources that the wealthy allow to trickle down. It reminds me of what we were just talking about in terms of reciprocal relationships. Like, if we're always in competition with one another, it's hard to be in collaboration
and community with
one another. And so if we can, again, if we can change that and not see ourselves as in competition, a lot of things would shift.
Yes.
So to jump back to class, poor settlers don't see themselves as connected to poor Indigenous people because we've been led to believe they're too different from us and we need to compete for the crumbs of the system.
Oh, wow.
And so if we start from a broader understanding of class, it's influenced by settler colonialism and white supremacy, and a real understanding of those things, then we can recognize how we're all actually in this together against the wealthy and powerful that make us compete like crabs in a barrel.
Yes.
For the crumbs.
Absolutely.
That they leave behind.
Oh, man. Well, first of all, you win points for connecting to two past pieces of media.
Well, thank you.
That we've brought to the table. But no, and seriously, I love this. Like, I love getting to have these conversations and engage with all of these brilliant pieces because I think it forces us to really engage in this opportunity to think about and confront the impact of things like settler colonialism and white supremacy in and on every aspect of our lives, in our society and our humanity. It's really wild. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right there.
Well, and I'll say that we're reading this because of the book Solidarity, because this was in the bibliography at the back.
Well done.
Yeah. So,
okay. Another star for you. Look at that. One of the questions that Nick Serpe asks Nick Estes to respond to, I was trying to pay attention. I wanted to pull something from Nick Serpe, the author of this, or I guess the author of this conversation, if you will, because I thought he asked some really brilliant questions.
Yeah.
He asked him to respond to this question of how can we learn from movements that coalesce around place, community, and threats to everyday life, and especially in the face of struggle and trauma and pain. And I loved Nick Estes' response to that, and in particular, his response in his book about this very topic. And so what he says in his book is this, quote, "Each struggle has adopted essential features of previous traditions of Indigenous resistance while creating new tactics and visions to address the present reality, and consequently projected Indigenous liberation into the future. Trauma played a major role. But if we oversimplify Indigenous peoples as perpetually wounded, we cannot possibly understand how they formed kinship bonds and constantly recreated and kept intact families, communities, and governance structures while surviving as fugitives and prisoners of a settler state and as conspirators against empire. How they loved, cried, laughed, imagined, dreamed, and defended themselves. Or how they remain to this day the first sovereigns of this land and the oldest political authority." To me, I mean, that makes me want to read this book. That was beautiful. To me, it speaks to this idea that there's beauty in struggle. And Nick Estes goes on to talk about the humanity that persisted in Indigenous people and communities that, you know, not only allowed them to live their lives, but also fueled their movement work and their demands. And he makes the important point that our movements today can learn a lot from that, which is, I think, a really critical takeaway from this.
Yeah, absolutely. As we think about how our movements today can learn things from history, we can also talk about application and
connection.
How this discussion between two Nicks, Serpe and Estes, apply to our day-to-day lives.
Yes.
My application is about decolonization. So Nick Estes touches on this briefly. He says, quote, "Most people think about decolonization would mean getting kicked off the land, or that Indigenous people would do to them what they did to Indigenous people in the past. It's a failure to imagine what a just future could look like. But it's also a failure to critically understand who owns the land in the United States and what the land is used for." And I thought that was brilliant. I love because the Dakota Nation versus the United States talked about land back some and what that looks like in a way. And here he's talking about what a liberated future looks like and how we include decolonization in that. I'm not sure what it looks like, and I recognize that I shouldn't be a leading voice in what it looks like.
Maybe not.
As a white settler in many ways, but let's recognize that liberation never actually looks like revenge.
Yes.
Right? Like a truly liberated society wouldn't then be founded in its future on seeking revenge from past actions of people who didn't commit those actions to begin with. In a lot of ways, like justice wouldn't start from there.
Of course.
Liberation wouldn't start from there.
Yes.
And so so many white people and so many settlers think decolonization and the abolition of white supremacy will look like revenge. They'll think it'll be revenge. And I love what Nick Estes says here when he says that that's a failure of imagination.
Yes.
And while I'm not sure what liberation looks like or how we get there beyond, you know, a few ideas we've learned over the last few years doing this podcast, what I do know is I believe in people to find it together because I can't not believe in people to find it together. Right?
Yeah.
Like I think of Miriam Kaba and hope being a discipline. I think that's part of my discipline of hope is that as people we can figure it out.
Yes, and we have to do that together.
We do.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Thank
friend.
you. Well, what about you? What's your application?
Yeah. That's just so good. I'm reflecting on what you said there. The application I was thinking about comes from the final pieces of wisdom that Nick Estes shares in this conversation about the climate justice movement. But I think it also applies to other movements and really all of our work as well. So I wanted to share it. He says, quote, "The climate justice movement is very diverse and it's all over the place. If there's one thing I can offer, it's to say we know what it's like to undergo apocalypse. Our worlds have been destroyed in many ways, and we're trying to rebuild them, reclaim them, and reestablish correct relations. The severity of the situation shouldn't undermine the willingness to act. Not to act, to succumb to a kind of paralysis of inaction, is itself an action. Not doing anything is doing something. Howard Zinn said it best, you can't be neutral on a moving train. Yeah, I think those words, and I loved this idea of what it's like to undergo apocalypse. That really hit me hard. We're living that right now. Yeah. So many of us are living that right now, every single day. And so, Nick is right. Inaction is not an option. We have to work. We have to push. We have to dream. We have to imagine a better world for ourselves. And we have to continue this fight for collective liberation. To me, there is no other option. And I think that connects brilliantly to your application, and we must do that together.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that quote too from Howard Zinn. I think about it. I think about it a lot, and it shaped a lot of what I do as an educator.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, great application all around. Let's talk about homework.
Okay.
How are we going to continue to learn about this conversation and the broader topics within it? Beyond our conversation today, I'm going to take the obvious one here is to read Nick Estes' book. Yes. So that's my homework. Let's put Our History as the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline, and the long tradition of Indigenous Resistance on our reading list because it sounds phenomenal.
Yes.
All the things that he shared from this was great. And I've really appreciated Nick Estes' work in this article and in the Lakota Nation versus United States documentary.
Yes.
And so I'm excited to read that at some point in the near future. We'll see when we can get to that book.
Absolutely. We've got a long list. I co-signed that, and I would say I'd also think we should add his other book mentioned in this piece. So Standing with Standing Rock, which he edited with, as you mentioned at the top, just Aaron and Dylan to our list. Standing with Standing Rock, Voices from the No DAPL Movement. So I'll claim that as part one of my homework.
Great.
The other thing I'd like to do is check out more pieces from Dissent, which is where you found this piece. I don't think we've read anything from them before. I can't recall the website. The website didn't look familiar to me, but we've also been doing this for a few years and memories.
Yeah.
But so I just think it'd be good to see what more we can bring to the table from them. I checked them out a little bit. They describe themselves as, quote, a magazine of politics and ideas and one of America's leading intellectual journeys and a mainstay of the Democratic left. So I'd love to just take a look at their website and try to bring something else from them to the table here in the near future. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's small D Democrat.
Yes, small yes,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Not affiliated with the party. That's what I mean by that. All right. Well, that's great stuff. Yeah, I really appreciated Dissent, and there's a lot of good suggested articles.
Yes.
As well. One including an interview by Olufemi Taiwo.
Yes.
About his book Reconsidering Reparations. So there you go.
So we know they got some good stuff there.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right, well, you're up next time, Damien. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Yeah, so I'm going to bring a piece from In These Times to the table for our next episode. The piece is called The Crackdown on Campus Protests is Just Beginning, which is by Adam Fetterman, and it was published on June 20th, so just a couple of weeks ago by the time folks are listening to this. And I full disclosure, I didn't read the piece yet, but it seems to be about how higher education institutions across the country have changed their policies on demonstrations in reaction to student protests on their campuses for all types of things like divestment and justice in Palestine, and the impact that has had and will continue to have, unfortunately, on higher education. So, I thought not only was this going to be a timely piece for us, given what we saw this spring on college campuses across the country, but, it certainly is of interest to both of us. I'll speak for both of us, given our day jobs, if you will. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to reading this one and talking about it with you next time.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. I think I saw an email from In These Times when they announced this. I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
So
I kept that email. I got it too. And here we are.
Here we are.
Email serving me well.
Yeah, look at that. Wow, emails actually being helpful in 2024.
What a concept.
Nobody would have thought we'd say that.
I love it.
Did we just endorse email?
Oh, man. They should pay us. That's a sponsor.
Yeah. All email.
We're
waiting by the phone.
Yes.
All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you all for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, Please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram and TikTok. Check us out on YouTube. Sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. We'll talk to you next week.